And having pressed that button, I would like to welcome everybody back to the University of Washington Tacoma's Labor Solidarity Project seminar on redefining American labor. Tonight's presentation, we've got Professor Rob Larson, who's going to talk about rebooting big tech. And he's hailing all the way from Tacoma Community College, so sort of up the hill from campus. Rob teaches economics at TCC, but it is not the economics that I recall during my undergraduate stint. It is the way he delivers it and the way he talks. It is much more engaging, much more exciting, and much more meaningful. I've been sort of listening to Rob in conversation on various podcasts lately, and one of my favorite comments he made was the fact that economics was the discipline that was sort of designed to describe or to reveal where the bodies are buried, which is, I think, one of my favorite descriptions of economics I've ever heard. Rob's the author of several books, working chronologically, Bleakonomics, Capitalism versus Freedom, The Toll Road to Serfdom, which is a classic title and subtitle. And then more recently, just this year, Bit Tyrants, The Political Economy of Silicon Valley, which is published by Haymarket. And ironically enough, is still currently available on Amazon. I was kind of surprised to see that. In addition to the books, you've just prolific author, I feel like, contributing to Jacobin, Dollars and Cents, and In These Times. And recently, if like me, you have found yourself doing a lot of dog walking and you found yourself listening to a lot of podcasts, good God, Rob, you have been super busy of late, which is why I'm particularly honored that you've taken the time to come in and speak to us tonight. I think, for this seminar in particular, you offer a much needed perspective. I think during our first seminar of this series, we had Emily Gundelsberger come in to talk about her work On the Clock, where she did some sort of immersive journalism within an Amazon fulfillment center. And I think your work really bookends with hers insofar as you're providing that kind of aerial view of the big picture, explaining kind of like, why the economy operates as it does. And then, how, thinking of last week's speaker, Stephen Greenberg, or Greenhouse, this idea of like how market forces and policy have worked to kind of beat us down, but they've also really worked us up. And I think what you so eloquently expose in all of your writing is that capitalism, despite the propaganda that would suggest the opposite, it's not synonymous with freedom, and in fact is often diametrically opposed. And I think, we can't understand labor without understanding those larger market forces. And as we approach this, within the seminar idea of redefining labor, we can't understand where we are today. It's not an inevitability. And continuing down that path isn't also inevitable. And that, in your work, by diagnosing these problems and by telling the truth, this isn't it's not an act of despair, even though reading about these truths can often be infuriating. And I found, Bit Tyrants to be, it's a page turner and your writing is fantastic, but there were just so many moments where like clenched fists to the ceiling in rage, as I heard about some of the exploits of these CEOs. But I think that by sort of raising this, the real narratives, this is sort of the first step down the road toward what I think could eventually be, liberation. So I want to thank you again for sharing your time with us, and more importantly, thanks for the work. We spoke beforehand and we decided Rob's going to talk for maybe 40-45 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. We've got some student submissions from questions ahead of time, but then I also wanted to encourage people to get on that public chat room. And we've got Casey is going to be helping me out organizing those questions as they come in. And Casey is telling me to make Rob a co-host, which I'm going to do right now.
Right on. Thanks, man. I appreciate it. Right. Evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to virtually be present and talk to you tonight. It's weird lecturing through video, but I was able to prepare the way I usually do for my normal classes, which is I look at myself in a mirror surrounded by light bulbs and I go, it's showtime. And that helps me prepare. So I feel very ready now to talk about this stuff. So we're going to talk about the tech industry and how it fits within capitalism and some of the issues around it tonight. And there's some pretty juicy stuff there. So we'll go ahead and dig right in. So technology, talking about the tech sector, those parts of our modern economy that are more advanced in their technology, and especially ones that rely on software or that operate on mobile platforms these days. That's kind of what tech refers to. Now, of course, that's just one sector of the economy. And after all, we have a capitalist economy, as economists will tell you. And broadly speaking, capitalism means an economic system where you've got private ownership of most property, including like large scale property like land and big industry and stuff, as well as markets to organize production through different price levels. So that's usually how we define capitalism: private property and using markets. Well, there's a lot to say about capitalism. People who are very supportive of capitalism will usually tell you it does two big things. One is that it produces a lot of growth, a lot of economic growth. And what that means typically is growth in production. So gradually, year after year, producing more goods and services than we did previously. So producing more food and more cars and more services of different types than we did before. That's capitalism. And people who hate and love capitalism will tell you strong growth is capitalism's middle name. And it's all about exponential growth. So it tends to grow in bigger amounts over time. And there's a lot of interesting aspects to that. It's certainly not a reliable growth pattern with capitalism. We're also prone to unpredictable recessions like the one we're having right now that can be caused by different things. But there's some other issues too. One, of course, is that capitalist markets usually don't have any provision for what we're doing to the environment. We're very proud that the economy grows by 2 to 3% a year. So every year we're producing 2 to 3% more than we did the previous year. Well, that's exciting. We need to realize exponentially growing things, that's like life forms. Like if you have bacteria growing on a plate, they don't grow by 10 organisms a day. They grow by 10 and then by 100 and then by 1,000, because each one of those new bacteria also reproduces, right? So that's exponential growth. When the economy grows like that, one issue we run into is that we exceed the natural limits of what the planetary systems can absorb. They can handle a certain amount of carbon dioxide and a certain amount of microplastic wastes in the ocean. But as the economy grows exponentially, so do the economic side effects, including, for example, the environmental aspects of that. And so I would just point out that what we call in economics, we call those environmental side effects, we call those externalities, because they impact people who are external to a transaction. Maybe I buy a car and I'm happy with the car and the dealership's happy with the money they got from me. But then driving the car contributes to global climate change and it melts the ice caps and it floods your home. Well, you had no role in my dumb car decision, but you're affected by it. So we call that an externality. That's one issue we get with capitalism there, with its growth. But the other thing that people who favor capitalism will tell you that's good about it is freedom. And that capitalism and the market economy, or the free market, as they'll sometimes say, it brings you freedom, right? Because unlike having a king or a dictator or something, with capitalism, the idea is you're free to choose. You're free to make choices. You're free to choose what you go and buy at the store. You're free to decide what career you want to go into. People can't dictate that to you. Okay, that's the traditional idea. And so that kind of freedom, where you're free from outside authorities or other people telling you what to do, we call that negative freedom, or sometimes negative liberty. You're free from outside coercion. And that's very valuable. Everyone recognizes that. On the other hand, though, some philosophers have suggested that there is a complementary idea of freedom called positive freedom, or positive liberty, or positive rights. And that's more about what you're free to do with the opportunities that you have. So, you have the opportunity to have different jobs. Okay, are you able to exploit those opportunities and use them, or maybe not, or maybe less than someone else, or what? So that's positive freedom. If you say that people, let's say our society produces a lot of healthcare, a lot of health services, you might say people should be free to consume some of the healthcare services that we produce. Maybe everyone should have a right to healthcare, and you support like a Medicare for all type of program, for example. That would be an example of using the idea of positive freedom. How can I really be free if I don't have the ability to do things? Is an argument that people make for positive freedom. And, I'm from a science background myself rather than philosophy. So to me, all these ideas are a little bit smushy, but I think there's some value in that framework there. So the traditional view with capitalism then is that capitalism provides negative freedom because you're free to choose among products and what your career will be. No one tells you what to do there. But it doesn't provide positive freedom. And more conservative, or as it were, libertarian figures, usually they're very skeptical of positive freedom as an idea because it implies all these entitlements that people have a right to healthcare or that people have a right to shelter if we produce a lot of it and it's empty and people need it. Well, positive freedom would say you should be free to consume some of that housing in the form of having an apartment. So the traditional view then is that capitalism provides the negative freedom, but not the positive freedom. Right. Under capitalism, there's no right to health insurance. The government would have to come in and impose that. Right? So that's the traditional view. Well, my book's a little different there, the capitalism versus freedom book that Alex mentioned. So, it's a whole argument in the book, but, trigger warning, parents cautioned, spoiler alert. My book argues that capitalism actually doesn't provide either of these forms of freedom. We agree that it doesn't provide positive freedom. But I would suggest that even our negative freedom is very substantially infringed on by capitalism because it comes with this huge concentration of wealth and also concentration of market shares among big companies. So in a second, we're going to talk about the tech sector. And what we see in the tech sector is a lot of monopolies, for example. That's where you have one giant company that more or less produces all of the products in some industry, So we call that monopoly. Like John Rockefeller used to have an oil monopoly in the 1800s, for example, the Standard Oil monopoly there. So that's a pretty common phenomenon under capitalism for all kinds of reasons, and markets really are very different from one another. One thing that I feel all economists do too much is to treat markets like they're all the same. And conservative economists do this, and Marxist economists do this. It's a very bad habit. If you look at the economy, just think about it. Like the goods and services that we produce, like they're so different, Smartphone chips and cell towers, back robes, car engines, building foundations, dental services, all of those things are market services that are produced in different sectors. Well, the products and services are so different. Why would the markets be the same? They're going to be different too, because it's different making steel than making legal services, So what we see is markets have developed in all kinds of different ways under capitalism. There's a lot of diversity there, but there are some common patterns. And one is that we see monopoly very, very frequently. And sometimes it's a less severe form of that, which we call oligopoly. Oligopoly is where you have a small number of giant firms rather than a single company. Like with monopoly, oligopoly is where you've got like 2 or 3 or 4 companies that dominate the market. So a great example of oligopoly for your notes is think of the cell phone carriers. Classic case, right? Sprint, T-Mobile Sprint now, they merged, and Verizon and AT&T. So those 3 firms completely dominate cell phone service, one of the most important industries of today, And it's because of different factors like economies of scale. There's all kinds of variety there. We're mainly talking about today, though, is the tech platform companies, Facebook and Google and Amazon and so on. And they have their own unique characteristics. And the most important ones there have to do with networks. So some goods and services are delivered to you through what we call networks, through connections among different users. Okay, that's not true for other products. If you buy a pair of sneakers, so you buy a pair of Nike running shoes, and then I buy a pair of those same shoes, my buying them doesn't make your pair like any more valuable. They're unrelated, right? But on the other hand, if you've got the first phone, okay, great, you're the only one with a phone. It's useless, call yourself. You can't do anything. As soon as other people get phones, suddenly the phone on your wall or in your hand these days gets more and more useful because suddenly there's more parties you can call that you can potentially reach and do business with, So with network-based markets, when more users use a particular service, it makes the value of that service bigger because other people are using it. So, I don't have kids, but many people do now. And I know parents these days have to make a decision about how old their kid has to be before they get a phone, modern smartphone, right? And people say, give them a phone at 14, at 16, or whatever. It's a new thing parents have to think about, right? Well, as soon as a kid gets a phone, your phone becomes slightly more valuable because there's one more party that you might reach, one more kid with an Instagram post you might like or whatever. But that's how those networks, that's how those markets work. Maybe a more obvious case would be a service like Facebook, right? I mean, what are you going to join? The network that has all your friends on it or the network that has none of your friends on it? As more people join Facebook, your dumb Facebook account gets slightly more useful. So it's more people who might see your ideas or who you might interact with, And this is what we call network effects in economics. It's where a service gets more valuable to you as other people use it. It's weird. And most industries don't have that. If I get a Honda and you have a Honda, it doesn't make yours any better. But that's not the same. It's not like that when you've got a smartphone or a social media network, And so what happens is markets that have network effects, they're more prone toward monopoly and just super concentration of all the market into one or two companies. They're more prone to that than other markets in capitalism. And again, many markets have a long history of monopoly, right? A century ago, we had monopolies in steel, oil. You could argue in banking, we had a cigarette monopoly at that time. Phone service, obviously, AT&T's monopoly for most of the 20th century, So pretty common. But with network effects, it's extremely likely. And the reason is it's just gravitational. People want to turn to the software or to the network that has the most users, And so another good example would be YouTube, right? Which Google owns, of course, having bought it a couple of years ago. So people go to YouTube because there's so many great videos on it you can watch, right? Well, because there's so many people there watching video, such a big audience, that attracts more video producers. If you got a video to show, you got to have it on YouTube in some form so that's where the audience is, right? And so the presence of more creators attracts more users and the audience gets bigger. And you get what we call a positive feedback cycle. More YouTube viewers attracts more video producers, which attracts more viewers, which attracts more producers, and so on to infinity. And that's why now YouTube has reached such a twisted, huge scale. People don't realize this. Every day, let's put it this way, YouTube video creators, they add 65 years of video to YouTube per day. Think about that until you go insane. That's your homework for me tonight, is think about that until you develop a mental problem. When you think about how much video that is, it's completely crackers, as we say in economics, right? But that's what network effects leads to, is these super hyper dominant hubs that everyone has to deal with if they want to be active in that marketplace. And the term we use once that stage arrives is platform economics. So something like Facebook, YouTube, Amazon's third-party marketplace is another example of this. We call them platforms. Platform economics is just a super elaborated network effect. It's where you have a super dominant place that people come to share their social media or their videos or sell products on Amazon or whatever. And the company that owns the platform tends to be a monopolist or at least a oligopolist. And so they tend to make these preposterous profits because everyone has to come to them and they can make money just from being like the landlord, just from operating a platform that brings everyone together. Microsoft's operating system Windows is another example of this. The mobile operating systems that run your phone, which is an oligopoly, right? You have Apple's iPhone, the iOS software, of course, and Google has Android for all the different Android running phones. It's a two company there. It's not a monopoly, it's an oligopoly, tiny number of huge firms. But that's a huge level of concentration. And my point with all this is that with capitalism, we say that we're supposed to have negative freedom and we're supposed to be free from big, powerful people or powerful institutions pushing us around, limiting our choices, telling us what to do. Well, I hate to tell people this, but when you have huge monopolistic platforms dominating our newest economic sectors, they have power. It's a real, true reality truth. that you are learning here. And this is something that people struggle with if you argue about these subjects. But an example I like is like consider an oil refinery. Okay, right now, the oil industry is going through crazy upheaval and price wars. It's interesting and juicy. We can come back to that in Q&A if someone wants to talk about it. But broadly speaking, like oil refineries, there's only so many of them in America, and they take all that raw petroleum that comes out of the ground and they refine it into all the stuff that we actually use. Propane for grilling, unleaded for your car or truck, right? Well, there's only so many of those things, and they're enormous. They have huge economies of scale. They produce an enormous amount of products. So if one of those things goes down, like occasionally there'll be a service problem at an oil refinery or a fire or something, and they'll have to shut it down for a couple of weeks, what you see is that gas prices spike up in big regions around that oil refinery because they were getting their gas refined products from that refinery. Now it's offline, so they have to truck it in from further away. There's less of it, and it's more expensive to get it there. But that shows the power that firms have when they have huge market share and just huge installations like that. If I run an oil refinery, I have a lot of influence over the prices that people pay for essential commodities like gasoline, okay? Or propane accessories, which are equally essential if you like to grill, So like that suggests the power that you have with private property. We're not talking about your personal private property, or what we call petty property, your personal phone, your toothbrush, your personal pairs of pants. No one cares about those. Those don't give you any power over other people. But if you own an oil refinery or a giant soybean plantation, or maybe you own the telecommunication wires in a region that let the broadband internet come into your home so your Wi-Fi will work. That's people like that a lot. You have a significant amount of power there. So it's true in market share and in ownership of that big scale private property. Doesn't mean you're God, but it means you have some real power over society, and you can threaten to lay off people, and you can demand government tax breaks and if you don't get them, you'll lay off people or move overseas. You do have real leverage if you operate a giant firm, but it also means money too. So consider Mike Bloomberg. Mike Bloomberg had a ridiculously inept and embarrassing run for president this year, and I'm delighted that he got humiliated on stage by Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders several times. I enjoyed that. I bet many of you enjoyed that too. Well, Michael Bloomberg, it turns out, he spent about $1 billion, we learned recently, on that campaign. So neighborhood of north or south of $1 billion there. Well, that put him on every screen in America. Like you guys watch things on cable TV, on YouTube, ads for Mike Bloomberg. And of course, it's all a bunch of BS whitewashing of his horrible legacy and pretending he's a progressive who cares about climate change. It's totally not what his record is about, but let's put that to the side. The point is, with $1 billion, you can get your message in front of every American and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. And it turns out, Michael Bloomberg, his fortune's in the neighborhood of $65 billion. So to get his face in front of every American for months on end, it cost about a 64th of his net worth. Even in the current messed up economy, he'll make that back in a year or two. This is the power you can have under capitalism. And when you've got that much power in your property, in your monopolistic market share, or just in your personal billionaire fortune, my suggestion is that leads you to have enough power to where it's legitimate to talk about that infringing on our negative freedom, So if Jeff Bezos is able to get every American mayor to get down on their knees and pitifully beg him to move their second headquarters to their town, and then he faces them all in the end and he puts it in New York and DC, the already two most powerful American cities. What a hilarious practical joke he played on everybody. But he knows as how far all those mayors are willing to go and exactly how much public money they're willing to throw at him. If that's not power, I'll eat my hat. Like you've got the states openly daring each other to try to outdo one another on what they're offering to Amazon. These aren't powerless institutions. Like they have real social influence, So with the tech firms, though, because they're so characterized by network effects and that platform economics, it means these companies are some of the most powerful institutions that we have these days. And just one way of seeing that I always refer to these days is, when I was a younger person, like in the 90s, back in the 90s, we had, if you looked at like the top 5 biggest companies, you know, you always have these lists of who the biggest companies are. And there are different ways of measuring that. The most conventional way is through what they call market capitalization. That's where you look at the stock price for some company like Amazon, and you multiply just that price per stock times the number of shares the company has. So it gives you like a hypothetical cost of what it would cost you to like buy Amazon or to buy Boeing or Walmart or whomever, right? So that's market capitalization. It gives you an idea how big the company is. Well, when I was younger, the 5 biggest companies would be, you know, Exxon, Walmart, Chase Bank, Microsoft, you know, Berkshire Hathaway, something like that. These days, the 5 biggest firms are all tech platform companies: Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook. Those are the biggest 5 firms. For several years now, you know, that's been the case. And the reason is those companies have insane value because we use them so much, and because they're monopolists or semi-monopolists. So they have especially strong market power positions, and investors buying Wall Street shares, they love that because that means the company will have pricing power and they'll make a lot of profits in the future. So those are the companies we're talking about. And a couple of those firms like Apple and Microsoft are $1 trillion companies now. Their total net worth is $1 trillion or more, which is preposterously large. Those are extremely big firms. And of course, right now with the virus confining us all to our homes mostly and making us work online for better or worse, mostly worse, it's making us just more reliant on those firms than we were before. We're spending more time on YouTube, more time on Facebook, putting more of our data in the cloud that Microsoft and Amazon operate, you know, and so their dominance is only deepening. And I mean, hell, like you're all young people. You guys know how much we're reliant on our phones. Like, you know, when you lose your phone or it breaks, how it completely upends your life for a couple of days until you get your feet on the ground or get a replacement phone and figure out a way around it. So this is kind of the dominance of these firms. And so, yeah, in my recent writing and my last book, I spend a lot of time looking at some of the aspects of this. One thing that I found really interesting is that, you know, these companies, you know, they're founded mostly by these young tech kids. I mean, they vary, but that's common. Well, a number of them knew when they were founding the companies, they knew what network effects are. And they would openly talk about them and say, if we can get network effects, we can become unstoppable and absorb all our rivals and crush them. So Mark Zuckerberg is on record in the pretty friendly corporate biographies that Fortune journalists and others have written about the company. And they talk about how when they were young and the company was still just booting up and being still run out of their dorm rooms, how they were aware that these networks gain value as more users get on them. And as people jumped off MySpace because Rupert Murdoch bought it and jammed it full of ads because he's a jackass, that drove people toward Facebook, which came out of the Ivy League schools. And for a long time, had no advertisements. And people really like that. They don't like seeing dumb ads all the time. But also an example I like is Jeff Bezos. Because again, in the very early days of the firm, we have him on record saying, you know, we can develop a flywheel. This company can develop its own network effects and its own platform. And Bezos in the early days was willing to give up the main retail arm of the business if it could lead him to have a bigger third-party marketplace, you know. So people go to Amazon to shop. That attracts all those third-party companies that you can buy from under the main Amazon listings, you know. And the presence of those merchants makes more consumers come, which attracts more of those third-party merchants. And they now account for over half of Amazon's sales. So Bezos was aware of this, Zuckerberg too. So it's not like these guys blundered into their monopolies. Like in the early days, we have very sympathetic reporters saying they were going, ooh, possible monopoly. Can I get a monopoly? So it was something that was definitely part of their reasoning, at least for many of these characters, you know. But again, because these firms are so huge and so powerful, the decisions they make have a lot of crazy ramifications. And what people should realize is these guys like have a long history of using their power to crush rivals and upstarts, you know. So Microsoft is kind of the oldest of the big 5 tech platforms now. It actually comes from the 80s. That's how old it is. Well, Microsoft in its early days, you know, it got a contract with IBM, which put out the first personal computers back in the early 80s, when laptops or just computers that fit on your desk instead of being based on vacuum tubes and taking up a whole room. They were just coming into existence. Well, Microsoft got the contract to get on those IBM PCs. Well, a bunch of business users bought them. That attracted software developers to make, you know, spreadsheet programs and games. Those fun applications attracted more users to the operating system, which attracts more developers, and you get the first real modern one of these network effects of the software era. Well, once Microsoft became a monopolist in its operating system, you know, the stupid Windows system that you have on PCs, it's interesting, they would use their power all the time because you have insane amounts of money when you're a monopolist, especially when you make an immaterial product like software, as Microsoft did. So whenever there would be a company like Novell or DRM that would have some new technology that Microsoft thought might threaten it down the road, what they would do is they'd send someone to approach that company and say, we at gigantic Microsoft are interested in your product. Perhaps we could work together. We could offer your product on our operating system. You should let us look at your software code. Yes, show us the code now. As soon as these firms shared the code, Microsoft would turn around and say, actually, we're not interested in working with you, and we're developing a surprisingly similar product in-house, just completely ruthlessly crushing these tiny firms. What are you going to sue? You're going to sue Windows, Microsoft, with your tiny startup budget? I doubt it. It's expensive to go to court. If you have a huge pile of money and you keep making it, it's not so easy to win your day in court. So Microsoft has that history. An example I like comes from Apple and Google. Google has such a sweet reputation even now. We should realize that it's a fairly power-mongering firm. When governments tell them to shut someone up, they'll shove them down in their search listings. They push down competitors for their comparison shopping service down on their search listings. They're actually in legal trouble with the European Union right now for doing that. So they do have that market power using history. But the one I liked the most was when they worked with Apple. So back in the mid-2000s, when Google and Facebook were exploding upward in their scale, and it was very difficult to hire enough software writers, and application code writers, software engineers to build out the platforms. Apple, which at that time was much bigger than the others, and under Steve Jobs, who everyone sort of reveres as this tech visionary and genius, they worked out a illegal price colluding conspiracy. And people, you shouldn't use the word conspiracy lightly. We know about this because it all came out in court. Like we have CEO emails about how, we're going to screw these people. Here's the plan. That's when it's appropriate to believe in a criminal conspiracy, when it comes out in court through the legally enforced, discovery phase, as you see on your Law and Order procedural shows. Then you can say, okay, these guys did conspire illegally, so it's a conspiracy. So it's not exactly an Alex Jones, the world is flat, Dick Cheney caused 9/11 conspiracy. This is something we have like legitimate legal reason to believe in. What we found out is Apple worked out a deal with several other big software employers of that time, including who do we have here? Intel, IBM, Comcast, Pixar, the filmmaker, and above all, Google. And they agreed that they would have a no poaching agreement. So one big way that Google and Facebook were trying to get software writers is they'd call Microsoft or Apple and say, hey, you're bored working for these jerks. Come work for our fun new company where it's exciting and we're doing a new thing and we'll give you stock options, So what these guys agreed to was a no poaching thing. And they had an actual do not call list and restricted hiring lists where I agree I'm not going to try to poach your engineers away if you agree not to do it to me. So it allows us to end up paying our engineers somewhat less because we're not competing for them, see. Now, libertarians and conservatives will say, well, this can never happen because free markets just have so many competitors, so many options. So if your boss isn't paying you enough, quit and find a boss that'll pay you more. It's pretty glib. People have to eat every day, unfortunately. Humans actually aren't commodities. So there's already sort of a unlevel playing field just from the fact that companies can leave a position vacant for a week, but your baby has to eat every week. We can't wait that long. So there's always a sort of lopsided bargaining relationship there. But with these firms colluding in what they were later criminally charged under what we call a wage fixing conspiracy, they agreed not to call each other and poach their engineers away, because the reality isn't, markets have 3,000 little firms, just go to the next one if you don't like how you're being treated. Why would you stay? The reality is modern markets are like, Apple and Google. They're the two makers of smartphone operating systems, Android and iOS. And if you don't like those, don't have a smartphone. Go back to your flip phone. Like, you're not going to do it. People don't want to give up all of the valuable goods and services that we get through these devices. I mean, after all, they're not just for Candy Crush anymore. We use these things, to apply for jobs and to go on dates and to keep up with world events. These things are important. So when they have a conspiracy on these scales, it's pretty significant. And what I like about the story is that toward the end of their wage fixing conspiracy, a little bit before they got caught, Apple and Google, they had an episode, a Google recruiter, someone trying to hire engineers to work for Google. They forgot about the hands-off list, or they ignored it or whatever. And so a Google recruiter actually did call an Apple engineer and try to hire them and poach them away, which they weren't supposed to be doing. Steve Jobs heard about it. And so we have, through the court cases, and I quote them in the book because it's interesting, it's pretty juicy. We have their emails about it. And he said, where is it? And Steve Jobs wrote back and said, is our agreement still valid? Like threatening to cancel the agreement and go after Google and try to offer their staff a huge amount of money to leave the firm. And so Google's CEO, who's then Eric Schmidt, he wrote back and said that offending recruiter would be fired within the hour, was how they put it. And Steve Jobs replied with a smiley face, the little colon and the closed parenthesis, like, oh, it's fun, smiley face, you fired someone, it's great. And what you discover is, I didn't expect this going into studying big tech and writing about it. These CEOs are sort of especially unusually prone to being bullying, tyrannical bastards. And again, like the record kind of has to be seen to be believed on this. But there's plenty of examples. Like Steve Jobs is one of these. Jeff Bezos is famous for losing his temper and humiliating workers in front of their colleagues. That's kind of just Jeff Bezos's version. Gates would just yell at people. Steve Jobs especially is known for being sort of a bullying douchebag to his subordinates. Remember, lots of people yell and are rude, but when your boss yells at you, you can't yell back. That's a rare workplace where you're allowed to call the boss a rude four-letter word when he does. Like most of the time, people need their jobs and don't just want to quit because of something the boss said today. So when the boss abuses you, you end up just kind of taking it, Like that's the reality of hierarchical workplaces within capitalism. And again, I think it's very difficult to say we have a huge amount of negative freedom. Most people aren't self-employed. And you have a boss. And if he says some horrible stuff to you, or threatens you or humiliates you or sexually harasses you, as Me Too has shown us, that's unbelievably prominent in the private sector, in the world of the free marketplace. People don't just want to change jobs overnight because your rent is in jeopardy. Maybe you can't feed Junior. So you end up trying to just move on from the fact that your boss fuels you up at the Christmas party. It's terrible. This is the kind of tyranny that you get within the workplace. And again, when firms have the ability to crush small operators that would try to challenge them, or when you can be abused in the workplace like that. What this says, I would suggest, is an economic system where we're a little bit less free than conservatives are sort of usually claiming when they tell you how easy it is to just give up your job and get a new one. It's easy. I work on Wall Street and it's easy. I have millions of dollars. It's no problem. Most of us, it's not so easily done, So there's a lot of other aspects to that. One I like is Facebook again. The Wall Street Journal, which is a very conservative newspaper. It's owned by Rupert Murdoch, who owns Fox News. They reported that Facebook has a whole, it's a huge firm, one of the biggest in the world. So it has a whole agency within Facebook that has full-time staff, and their jobs are nothing but look at every new startup that's coming down the road, see ones that might threaten Facebook in the future, and get rid of them in some way. So offer their founders $500,000 to give them the patents, so you take them over that way. Or if they won't, crush them in some way, get their suppliers to not work with them, or their distributors, or find some other way to ruin them. Copy their product and put it on your monopolistic platform so everyone sees it there. Instead, that's a good way to do it. Lots of options to crush people when you're a remote, powerful bastard like these guys are. So this, to me, shows us the amount of power plays that we get within capitalism. At this point, it's tough to say it's a system of freedom. And when the Wall Street Journal was talking about Facebook there, I don't think they meant this ironically, but this is what they said. They said, so Facebook has a whole operation to keep any firm from disrupting Facebook. It's kind of funny, right? These tech guys always talk about how they're so disruptive. And we're disrupting this industry, we're disrupting music, or disrupting the cab industry. But now that I'm big, I'm a huge corporation, I'm gonna make sure I have people to make sure I don't wanna be disrupted. It looks terrible. This is what power is. When you crush others and can't be crushed yourself, when you scream at your workers and they can't say anything to you. So we can talk about this. I'm sure you'll have some questions at this point. But these are sort of the issues that some of us who are more critical about the economic system talk about. And we write a lot about this stuff for sources like Current Affairs, Jacobin. I recommend those things for the students listening, just as places to explore slightly more critical views about what's happening in our world than you're going to get on, CNN or the Washington Post.
Excellent. Yes, take a drink. That was fantastic.
Thirsty work.
Yeah, and we do have some questions rolling in through the chat board. So if you've got questions for Rob, throw those up there. We're going to sort through them as they come in. We've got some student questions coming in. But before we got there, I did want to ask you about the just that kind of like that sort of mythology that's attached to these sort of wonder kid tech CEOs and their corporations, and sort of how the sort of the mythologies attached to these people and these corporations, how those may or may not sort of match up to the realities. You've already talked. I love the impressions, and you've talked about sort of Bezos and Gates and some of their less than kind treatment of their workers. I'm kind of curious, in an era of sort of waning American economic dominance, like, is there something culturally valuable that we're sort of finding in these companies and in these personas that makes us want to sort of look at them as like, disruptors or problem solvers?
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, after all, that's how they're always portrayed to us when you watch the news about these guys, or when you read their media, when they talk about themselves, which they enjoy. It's always about what visionary geniuses they are. So like, again, go back to Steve Jobs, because he's sort of a singular figure. Like, he's one of these many tech billionaire founders, but Steve Jobs like now is like the visual image of the modern visionary, with his dumb black turtlenecks and boomer jeans on stage. Like, that's become like the go-to archetype for like really all modern capitalists, and certainly in tech. And when you watch movies about billionaires who fight crime, like Iron Man and Batman, it's all based on Jobs and the tech guys of today, So like, there's a lot of media presentation that pushes you that way. But really, I think the main reason why we have this favorable view of them has to do with the technology itself, because what they're happy to tell you is that they invented the technology. So sure, you might dump on Google, but I love their search engine. It's so useful. Oh, I know Steve Jobs was a jerk, but I love my phone. It's so much fun. I love my phone. And so people will say, yeah, but they invented the technology. So they earned their billions of dollars. They earned their rude words to their subordinates. Here's the thing. Most of these firms did not develop the key technologies that they now monopolize and built their platforms around. And actually, I have a whole separate chapter on this in Bit Tyrants, because I think it's such an important subject. You look at these firms, I mean, there's variety. They have a lot of different services they're providing. But the main pattern that we see, the hard technology and the software itself, comes from public sector investments. And I mean, the easiest way to see that is through the internet itself. The internet. The internetwork, connecting all the different networks for communication around the world, was originally called the DARPA net, because it was developed by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration, which is the Pentagon, the military's main research agency. So between DARPA and a couple of big computer science universities like MIT and some others in California, they put together the early prototypes for internet connectivity in the late 80s, early 90s. And by the 90s, it becomes useful enough that regular people like me, who don't understand how software works, can use it. And at that point, it was privatized. Okay, the National Science Foundation sort of organized that, becoming a privately owned network. And now the telecommunications companies and cable companies like Comcast and AT&T control our access to it. But it was all public sector technology, because after all, with scientific R&D, you never know if you're going to ever make a breakthrough. People, I come out of the sciences myself. My undergrad was in biology. People, you watch movies about geniuses, and it's all like, I'm a genius, and oh, I just want to invent this. I invented it. That's not how it works. In the sciences, you're always kind of blundering in the dark. You don't know what you're going to discover. Who knows how soon you'll make a discovery, let alone if it's going to make you money. And if you're in the business world, you're always under the gun to meet profit targets, to pay your bills, to be as profitable as Wall Street thinks you should be, so your stock price goes up and you make money. you know? So it's very difficult to expect business firms to do this long-term research. On the other hand, the government and public research entities like the universities or the military, they've got the stable funding to go on forever blundering around until they find something. And indeed, it's not just the internet. So again, Steve Jobs, again, when he first unveiled the original iPhone in 2007, he talked about all the components and the fancy multi-touch display, you know, on your phone. And he said, we invented it, and boy, have we patented it. Like, that's a famous thing that he said. Well, it turns out almost all the components, like the physical components of your smartphone, are the legacy of years of your parents paying taxes during the Cold War era for the stuff to be developed. So the GPS chip that was developed by, I believe, the Army Signals Office, you know, the Wi-Fi technology was developed by the University of Hawaii so that all the island campuses could share computing time. That's the origin of that technology, you know. And the multi-touch display itself, where you can do so many different things just by touching the glass surface of your phone, that stuff was actually developed by CERN, the Particle Collider Laboratory in Western Europe, as a way of managing this super complicated machine that they had to operate. So if you take a look, almost every significant part of these smartphones was developed in the public sector and then was privatized, or some person who worked on it patented it later on and was able to turn it into a private company. Even Google itself, I'll finish with this, like Google's original web address was not google.com. It was google.stanford.edu, because they developed it on this research campus in California where you don't have a regular profit goal you got to meet. And so we're able to spend time coming up with a complicated mathematical algorithm that makes the searches better and better as more people do them, which means Google search also has a network effect. As more people search on it, it gets less and less clumsy. And that's why it works pretty well today compared to like Bing, which Microsoft keeps on life support, but doesn't get nearly as many searches, so it can't be as good as Google searches. So the key thing is, you know, why do we see these guys as being visionaries? Well, they're eager for us to believe in how great they are. But the reality is this stuff comes from the public sector. Like, you and your parents paid for this stuff to be developed, and now you pay again when you heap a bunch of money into these tech platforms or watch the commercials they show you one way or another.
Thanks. Now I feel somewhat implicated as a university employee now. Thank you. Now I too am complicit. I was wondering, a question came in from one of the students ahead of time, just sort of addressing the, you know, is it worth comparing the monopolies we're seeing today to the monopolies of the Gilded Age? Is it worth looking back for solutions to our contemporary problems, or is the model just obsolete at this point and we need to sort of think new?
Well, the comparison itself, I think, is pretty justifiable because they do it. So we're talking about comparing today's monopolies like YouTube or Windows back to ones that we had in the Gilded Age, like Rockefeller's oil monopoly or Carnegie's steel monopoly. Well, the tech giants of today themselves make that comparison. So I guess it's reasonable to do it. So Bill Gates is on record as talking about how interesting Rockefeller was and how people shouldn't have been so mean to him just because he had a violent monopoly that ruthlessly destroyed its competitors and absorbed them. He talked about how much he loved Ron Chernow's biography of Rockefeller because it's so good and it sympathizes, at least up to a point, with Rockefeller. And also like the Wall Street Journal, which again is very conservative. It's owned by the same guy, billionaire who owns Fox News. I always say its editorial page is kind of like Fox, but with AP English. So if you want a little fancier source, you can turn to that. They themselves compare these tech platforms to like the railroad monopolists of the old days. You know, back before you could drive your own car somewhere, if you wanted to move goods or travel between cities, you rode on the railroads. Well, we had monopolies on routes very commonly at that time, as we do today, since we deregulated the railroads in the 1980s Staggers Act, because railroad service, just like phone service, just like online video, it's got a network effect. I'm not going to lay down 500 competing rail lines between DC and New York. There's only going to be a couple built. And if one firm can buy them all, then yeah, you're going to have a regional monopoly there, which we do have in rail in a lot of regions to this day. The Northeast is like the only exception there. Now, should we do the same remedy? Well, I think that's an interesting question. Because, you know, we have a private, you know, we have a capitalist economy. You know, we don't have socialized property where the workers run these things, worker control the means of production, stuff like that. We're a capitalist society. So what we do have is anti-monopoly laws. Most capitalist countries have some version of these. The European Union, they call them the competition laws. Here in the United States, we call it antitrust. There's a ton of different terms for it. What they basically are supposed to do is to keep like oligopoly companies from merging into a monopoly, and to keep oligopoly companies from colluding and secretly working together to screw people over, like in the example of Apple and Google that we mentioned a minute ago. So that's what antitrust is supposed to do in the United States. What we discover is I wouldn't really recommend trying to go back to that. And the tech companies are under investigation right now. It's kind of on hold for this crisis that we're going through, but it'll probably come back next year once we're on the other side of this nightmare. And they're being investigated by the Justice Department, the Federal Trade Commission. Those are the American bodies that can enforce anti-monopoly laws. They're pretty limited, though. The issue is, they're made by government. And so when the government's kind of, when the US government kind of transitioned from the more liberal New Deal period, from the 30s to the 80s, tax the rich, jobs program, EPA, regulate the companies, break up the banks. In the 80s, we transition over to what they call the neoliberal period, where we're more about being pro-market. We cut taxes on rich people. We deregulate Wall Street and other industries. At that time, antitrust also had a big decrease in how aggressively it was enforced. And I think a good way to see that is that with antitrust in America, we used to break up monopolies under law using the Sherman Antitrust Act. So Standard Oil, Rockefeller's oil monopoly, he lived to see his monopoly broken up, where the government legally forced them to sell off chunks of the business to break up its monopoly position. We call that a forced divestiture in economic legal language. So that happened in the 1910s. And we used to do that with some frequency. We broke up other companies during that time. The last time we broke up a monopolist in America was 1982, when most of you were negative 15 years old. And the company we broke up then was AT&T, which had a phone service monopoly. I mean, think how powerful that is. You control all the nation's phones back before you had the internet, when that was the way you could reach people. Huge amount of power there. We broke them up in 82. Haven't broken up one of those guys since then. We don't really enforce these laws as aggressively as more conservative Republican administrations and more pro-business Democrat administrations like Clinton and Obama. They're not going to break up Wall Street. They're going to maybe raise their taxes slightly is the most they'll do. So going back to the old remedies, I'm a little skeptical of that because they're so reliant on political forces. I'd rather try something a little more dramatic and talk about things like worker control and stuff like that.
Well, and I think too, the lobbying power these industries have because of their, sort of unlimited funding, but also too, in your book, you talk about how, these companies have not only sort of emerged from public funding, but they now have contracts with the U.S. government in many cases for cloud computing. So I mean, it would almost be sort of in the government's, it would be working against their own self-interest to sort of work to disentangle these monopolies.
That's a really good point. Yeah, it's true. So the firms by now, these tech platform giants, these are some of the biggest lobbying spending firms in America now, which is a very competitive title. As I recall, in 2018, only Comcast, the internet and cable provider, only it spent more money on federal government lobbying than Google did. Which shows, these firms are spending many millions of dollars per year on it. They aren't yet on the scale of like the most dominant industry we have, which is still Wall Street and banking. Those firms have, as I recall, it's 6 lobbyists for every member of Congress, which that's what power is. You can swamp these people's offices with proposals and demands they not be regulated. But Silicon Valley's coming up right behind them there, especially because they're in the spotlight more and under more investigations. So they have more at stake. So they're going to be lobbying more. But that's a really good point that you mentioned there. It's, it's a two-way street. People, when you talk to, again, more perhaps conservative economists who do dominate the field, sadly, they'll tell you, well, the government has the power. You could say, Larson, that companies have power, but they don't really. Only the government can force you to pay taxes. Only the government can put you in jail. So only they have real power over you. Companies don't have any power. I would say if you have the power to shut off the gasoline or the internet in a region, you have power too, because they do make our products for us. But putting that aside, the state has a huge amount of power, but they're codependent power centers, which is very common historically. Like in the Middle Ages, you had, powerful national governments, mostly monarchs in those horrible days. But you also had the church the Catholic Church in most of the countries of the Western world at that time. And they share power. They have overlapping power. They have areas where each one of them controls, and they kind of butt heads and fight over things. And then they'll collaborate on this thing over here. They have like shifting power relations, just like different countries do today. Make an alliance when it's in your interest, break it off later, And the same is true for the private and public sector. So that's very true. Like now the state is pretty reliant on firms, for all kinds of things, because we privatize so many services, but especially stuff like, data management now. So recently there was a big controversy last year regarding the Pentagon's effort to modernize its data storage systems and move over to cloud storage of the system. And they're calling it in a very sacrilegious way. They're calling that JEDI, right? The Joint Enterprise Defense Initiative, I believe is what it stands for. How dare you use that? Oh God, makes me want to induce vomiting right now. I'm so disgusted. Don't get me started on that. But that's a huge cloud computing contract from the Pentagon, and they wanted a contractor to do their cloud computing, where instead of having all your data stored on site and having your own IT staff for your business, you put it on the cloud. So you hire some cloud computing provider. The two hugest ones by far are Amazon and Microsoft. And you let them manage your data on their giant data, their server farms, their gigantic data centers that drain energy like there's no tomorrow. Well, that's a very easy way for firms and states to store their data, to manage their data processing and number crunching and stuff like that. Well, there's a big controversy because the Pentagon wanted to award that JEDI contract, which is a multi-billion-dollar, many-year contract, only to a company that had the highest security clearance. But there was only one of those, which was Amazon, because it manages data for the CIA on its cloud service, which is Amazon Web Services, which is also funny because Jeff Bezos is a libertarian, supposedly, but here he is not just hosting government data, but CIA data, like the people that torture dissidents around the world, So Jeff Bezos, he's not even a principled, twitchy-eyed Lex Luthor ruling class rectal ward. He's just an opportunist. What we see there is they actually end up giving it to Microsoft, and now Amazon's taking the Pentagon to court, saying that Trump made that decision because he doesn't like Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon, or much of Amazon, because Bezos also bought the Washington Post, which is critical of Trump, and that's the only thing that he considers is media coverage of himself. So people are speculating, and Amazon is claiming that's why Microsoft ended up getting the JEDI contract, even though they didn't have the highest level of clearance, because they weren't already working with the CIA. But it shows you now like how intertwined, exactly like you said, these entities are. Like they rely on one another. When I wrote about this in Capitalism versus Freedom, I remember I called that title Codependence Day. Because I'm trying to emphasize how much, they're both different powerful centers, and they overlap and they arm wrestle over different stuff. But it's not going to be this nice, efficient, free market outcome that everyone likes to talk about.
Nice. We got a couple more questions rolling in here, and I wanted to kind of take it down from the cloud to the actual workplace. A couple questions sort of clustered around what actual working conditions look like in these industries, including someone who wanted to know whether or not Silicon Valley is accurate in its depiction of how cutthroat the industry is. But then we've got two more, one UW-T specific. We've got students who are tuning in right now, who are hopefully graduating at the end of this quarter with degrees and ready to enter the field of software development or IT. Got one question just on sort of what advice would you give them on how to protect workers in these fields from becoming commodities, which I like in that question there. And then another related question, just some of the specific tactics. I guess this would be sort of the other side of this question. What are the tactics that these companies are using to sort of actively weaken worker power? And have you seen success? Are there reasons to be even a little bit optimistic at this point?
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, I know the answer to all these questions, so this will be very easy. So the working conditions start there. Like what you do see is, like most industries, there is variety. And when we talk about how much money or influence people have, we sometimes get to what they call class analysis. We break down people's wealth and influence based on what they do and the roles they have in society, which, gives you some insight. So one thing we traditionally do there is, politicians talk about, I support the middle class, which is kind of vague. We could be a little more specific. So sometimes we break down that middle class into a blue collar and white collar, those segments, like working class or professional class workers. Well, in tech, most of the workforce is professionals, white collar professionals working in nice, pleasant offices, writing software, designing platforms, operating them day to day, keeping them from crashing. There's real work there. And those people put in real hours. So that's the majority of their workforces. And a lot of people, white collar jobs are very nice, like academics. You sit in an office and you have headaches, but you're not exactly working on an offshore oil platform. With that kind of work. But we need to recognize these companies all have blue collar parts of their workforce. Amazon's an obvious case because they have so many people operating their warehouses and distribution centers, and these days doing the actual last line of delivery. So we'll kind of come back to Amazon in just a moment because they're sort of associated with that. But just to mention the others real fast, like Google and Facebook, for example, we think of those companies as being almost entirely online, because it's software based, because it's an information based product. You never actually touch it. We have to realize these guys do have big blue collar workforces, often with temporary contract based workers who don't get benefits and have no job security and very low pay. And often what they're doing is content moderating. YouTube uploads 65 years of video a day. Don't forget to think about that until you go insane for Monday. That's your assignment. For years, they refused to even monitor it or curate the platform, except for when a newspaper would flag a terrorist beheading video, they'd say, okay, we'll take that one down. But gradually now they've started, now that their huge monopolistic status is ingrained, they're willing to put some of their gigantic resources into paying people tiny amounts of money in the Philippines and Indonesia, or even domestically, to go through these YouTube videos or Facebook posts. And what you discover is they don't just see everything that's uploaded. They see stuff that gets flagged by us users. So when you see a video of a child soldier in Africa or a murder in Florida that's been Facebook live streamed or something, people flag it. And then these poor contract working, low paid temp workers have to look at just video at clip after clip after clip after clip of the worst stuff that you can possibly imagine. Say what you will about working in a slaughterhouse where you're killing pigs and cows all day, at least you know what's coming. These poor bastards, it's just horrible murder after sex assault, after war atrocity, after there's just no end to it. And you see a clip for 7 or 8 seconds and you have to make a decision about what kind of treatment the platform will give it. And then you move on to the next heinous thing. And that goes on for 8 hours and now you get $60. It's incredibly terrible conditions there. That's blue collar work if I ever heard of it. But it's true, Amazon is kind of most notorious now for how it treats its blue collar workers. And here's where we are seeing resistance these days. There is a labor movement renaissance happening now during this virus. Workers are not accepting that they're just going to be exposed to this virus and die in large numbers so that our GDP can keep growing conveniently. So we're seeing significant actions, even with Amazon, which is seeing staff walkouts for various reasons, but above all, concerned that they're not doing enough to space out the workers and to clean facilities to do what can be done to keep them safe from coronavirus, while the rest of us white collar people stay at home and get products delivered. It's very nice. So we have workers that are leading walkouts over this, and Amazon's firing them and saying, you violated social distancing. I mean, lots of people do, but you're annoying me for leading a union drive or a walkout, so you're fired. And they're getting some actual press attention from this and everything. That's how huge these firms are, that even their minor labor struggle episodes are still getting ink. It shows the importance there. And Amazon and Apple, of course, would be the other famous case, because of course these fancy phones, the software is made in California, but all the parts are made, almost all the parts are produced overseas, and then they're all assembled in those giant, heinous Taipei Precision Manufacturing Company plants, the Foxconn plants in Shenzhen and a couple of other Chinese locations, where they work under such heinous, humiliating, badgering conditions that they've had a number of labor problems there, including one episode that's become kind of famous, and which I cite in the book, where workers were committing suicide like throwing themselves off the top of their worker dormitories that they're housed in this nightmarish dystopian Chinese Apple manufacturing centers. And so it got to where then the company retaliated, not by giving these people pay or benefits, but by putting up suicide nets like around the top of the building. So, you can't kill yourself. We fooled you. And then what we discover is, and I didn't hear about this until I started doing the research. What happened is then groups of these Foxconn workers would together say, we're all going to kill ourselves together. Your net can only hold up so many people. We're all going to jump through. We're all going to die. And so, and they would get Foxconn to like offer them small concessions on, on pay or on, work conditions or whatever. And so that's a rare example of what we call a suicide strike, by threatening to end the gift of life for yourself rather than go back to that goddamn workplace. Like that is an extreme labor market action. It's fascinating. But this is what's happening in today's work conditions. Now, as for Silicon Valley, the TV show, I love Mike Judge, excuse me. And, big fan of his shows. They're always very funny. Silicon Valley show is very funny. It's also kind of a cutesy, fun treatment of it. The hyper ruthlessness of it and the goofy, shallow nonsense premises behind a lot of apps and unicorn firms pushing them, that's very close to life. I will say Judge is a very astute satirist. He's very able to see what's silly or goofy about an industry and make it exaggerated. But I would say he sort of underestimates how much the platform giants that we have, like the huge brand name ones, how much they dominate these industries, and they see challenges coming years away and use their money to crush them or buy them out in some way. I feel like a little bit more of that I would like to see, but they do have versions of that, and I do like that the venture capitalists and CEOs are portrayed as crazy, bumbling egomaniacs. That's very representative. So it's a good show. It's a good show, a little cuter than the reality, great cast, very funny. Everyone should watch HBO. What can I tell you? But as far as what I would give advice for new tech workers, I will say some of my own students say they want to go into this field. So this is a question that we get asked, right? And I would say any field that you're going into, unless you go straight into owning your own business, which is very difficult and the odds are against you keeping your firm alive. So God bless you if you do that. But most of us go into working at some big workplace once we graduate from school. That's kind of the typical thing that happens. Maybe later you start your own firm. So it means whether you go into tech or banking or construction or whatever sector you might go into, you're going to have big, powerful firms that dominate the market. Maybe they work with government and maybe they don't. You always have variety. You're probably going to have some kind of tyrannical boss. And like a lot of tyrants, they might be nice. Some kings are nice. But that's not an argument for kings. Maybe tomorrow their wife leaves them or they have a stroke and they become bastards. Like people shouldn't have that much power is an argument that was made against kings. And that's why we should have a republic. Socialists make that argument for capitalism too. Like you can have your own strategy and you should be thinking about what you're willing and not willing to do, especially you tech workers, because you guys have such very impressive, unique knowledge. I mean, I wrote about the economics of this field, but like writing software code or soldering together circuit panels and putting chips in there, like those are arcane, scarce skills that you guys had to work for years to learn. That means you have some leverage. And these workers now, I can tell you, at Google, at Amazon, at Microsoft, they are working to organize themselves in different ways. Sometimes just informally, just make a little club among your coworkers. Sometimes it's more we're trying to organize to get recognition for our labor union. So we have actual collective bargaining. So we have actual influence and power relative to our boss. We can actually say, no, we're not going to build that. Like there's the tech won't build it movement where people are saying that tech workers won't design like AI for drones to blow up people in the Middle East, But it turns out, some people will build it. It's difficult to resist institutions on your own. These are trillion-dollar platform companies. Even if you don't go to work for one of the big five, you're going to be working for some multi-million-dollar firm at least, most likely. And they're going to have a lot of power over you if you're a lonely individual. Individual workers, the way we deal with the huge institutions that capitalism creates because of market processes like economies of scale or network effects or whatever it is, we need big chunks of capital in business to produce goods efficiently so we can have affordable phones and affordable food and fun online services like this. But that means we have to be organized to have any kind of countervailing power to give at least a veto over the decisions that these tech CEOs make. So my advice would be, think critically about who you're going to work for. Have your principles, but know that it's hard to stick by your principles when it's you versus a CEO with $1 trillion firm. Best to work with your colleagues, get to know them, break out of, within social distancing for a while, but get to know your coworkers. America's a pretty atomized society. People live alone and, hang out alone increasingly. I don't think that's so good. People get together, they have actual influence when you and all your coworkers can do what those Google workers did and walk out because Google gave a huge payout to Andy Rubin, the guy who created the Android operating system. And then it turned out he had several credible sexual harassment allegations against him, and they still gave him millions of bucks on his way out the door. They had a walkout of Google because of that. That's not the CEOs being liberal. That's the workforce giving a shit, And Amazon's having walkouts over COVID-19 conditions. They should. If they absent that, Jeff Bezos is going to say, here's some gloves, get back on the line, you little bastard. It's by getting together that we have the ability to say, none of us are going to work unless you do this. Now it's not just you, it's you and your whole group of workers. Now you have some influence. So those are things you might consider if you're embarking on a career in this kind of interesting, fast-growing industry.
Nice. Do you have time for another one or two questions?
Oh, of course, yeah.
Speaking of social distancing and the pandemic, we did have a couple questions surrounding, what's going on right now and whether or not this is an opportunity for organizing. Is this a moment to push back, or do you think? I know it's incredibly difficult right now because we're sort of in it, but do you anticipate this being a moment of resistance, like you've been identifying sort of little bits of activism, or is this going to be sort of a larger moment of just kind of power consolidation? These companies, as we're sort of binge watching Netflix and.
Indeed, we all are, and including me. Again, the first page of my book is, let me say I use these companies' products all the time. Try not to. It's impossible. That shows how dominant they are and how much we rely on them. It's only more true now that we're stuck at home, most of us, and can't rely on others and getting our social contact through. At least this is better than nothing at all, And I will say, we economists are really bad at making predictions, so I'm not going to predict how this is going to work out. But I will say this, it's times of crisis very often that people make these big strides. It's like the big build out of the American labor movement, which is why we have, workplace health insurance, and why we have, the weekend, for God's sake, just basic stuff we take for granted and had to be dragged out of the business community against their will by everyone going on strike in factories today. Like, a little of that goes a long way. You can get your demands, but that, that build out happened during the Depression, in the 30s, when the economy was shrinking, not as fast as today, but ended up going a lot deeper in its decline than we probably will. This country is really botching its testing. Until we have testing, we can't fully reopen the country. So it's unclear how long this is going to go because we have such incompetent leadership. What are you going to do? So that part we'll all be surprised together. But I will say, when you have times of chaos like this is when power centers within the system are under stress. And when they're under stress, when they're scrambling, like Amazon right now is saying, it's so busy delivering packages to everyone who's quarantining, that it's like Christmas time conditions, holiday season conditions every day, like when they're super busy. That's why one reason why these workers are doing walkouts. I mean, the main thing is they don't want to get COVID-19 in their stupid workplaces so that we can get, our box of tissue sent to us without us having to touch it. But also, this is the time when you can get concessions from them. When they have nothing else going on and when they're super profitable, it's harder to drag a concession out of them, like give us health insurance or something like that. So you can make a case that when institutions are struggling, this is the time to hit them. You wait till they have a moment of vulnerability, big, powerful institutions, before workers have a chance to get something out of them. But also, when you have a crisis like this, it's like a war. People get scared. When people are scared, they're, if anything, a little less likely to challenge authority. If we had President Joe Biden right now, everyone would be saying, just listen to Joe Biden, do what he wants. Because we have President Genius Clown, everyone's freaking out, and understandably so. But so I don't know, it's always mixed dynamics going into big emergency circumstances like this. So I think it's unclear, but we're seeing an increase in labor activism right now. People are walking out of meat plants in this country because they don't want to on top of their nightmarish working conditions, they don't want to get sick. And they're often poor immigrant workforces that have no savings, that can't go to the hospital, and they might get deported by ICE when that happens, you know? So I don't know. I would say that's up to us to decide how we use this moment, you know?
Yeah, and I think if you sort of look at this moment as sort of almost similar to a war effort, and I mean it's obviously been compared to this invisible enemy, looking back World War I, World War II, and sort of the way that the government sort of got involved in sort of union negotiations, and it seems like, as with so many things nowadays, it's just you can't really rely on the government to do anything with any kind of competence. But yeah, I think it's, it remains to be seen. And I think too, there's always the danger of the PR attached to, the actions by these now hero essential workers, who are really just doing their job, and the potential sort of backlash surrounding, walking out and leaving, middle-class America without their, all the goods and services we need to consume constantly, right?
Mm-hmm. It's true. People often don't want to be seen as like taking advantage of the emergency conditions, because that looks really bad. But because a lot of these workers are saying, we're not taking advantage, like we're going to get this disease on the job, and if we're all in ICUs, like we won't be able to serve you your products anyway. So I would say the labor side of this is a little more defensible, but it's true. Like right now, I mean, I just wrote about this in Current Affairs, like the tech platforms are really working to be on their best behavior during this stuff. And Facebook, which caught a lot of hell over 2016, letting different kinds of misinformation, some of it funded from overseas, confuse the election process, so they've got, they're blocking event notifications for people protesting, the social distancing and mask orders, YouTube, which has become Google's YouTube, which has become notorious for, you click on an astronomy video and 2 clicks later, you're watching flat earth video. Like it prioritizes goofy fringe content because that keeps people watching longer because it's nutty, which has the effect they see more ads, which Google wants, but it also means people get insane ideas, and everyone's on YouTube. So now when you open YouTube, it has like an overlay with videos from the CDC, the Centers from Disease Control. The boring, reliable CDC is on the front of YouTube's homepage. When did that start? Well, it started when this was a crisis. YouTube wants to be seen as being on its best behavior. And Microsoft and Amazon and every corporation's commercials now are all about how they love us and support nurses, not by paying them more, but just by saying they like them with nice, cheap words. So the companies are on their best behavior right now because they don't want to be seen as taking advantage of the crisis. But it is the case that they are. Amazon is still firing organizers. YouTube is still curating its algorithm and showing you pretty goofy videos if you click up past a couple from the very first page. So it's true, but it just means that conditions are more like volatile right now, I would say. And it'll probably take a little while to see how the balance of forces is playing out. It's a great time to be getting organized and to be learning and reading about this stuff. Many people want to, especially younger people, see the horrible things that are happening, and they want to take action. They want to stop this stuff. I would just say, maybe this is my educator talk, my inner educator talking, but many people are willing to do that kind of dramatic action. But first you have to understand who has power in the society, what really limits our freedom, which is not just powerful government, but powerful businesses and banks and platforms and corporations. And once people have an analysis, then you can figure out what's important. And when you do a big protest and you block I-5 to protest the Iraq war, people can understand that. And even if they're pissed off and miss work, they at least understand what the issues are. Right now, people do big demonstrations about Google monitoring people, and people barely know what the issue is, So the education part has to come first, and that might be something for people to think about.
Nice. We've got one final question, and I'm actually going to unmute a member of our audience to ask it. Mercedes, are you there?
Yes, hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi. Excellent seminar, by the way. I'm very engaged. But anyway, kind of going back to the beginning of the seminar when you were talking about like capitalism and what does freedom mean in capitalism. So it's kind of like a two-parted question. So what does freedom mean to the working class in corporate America? And what can the government do to ensure that the working class can share some of the freedom the ultra rich enjoy?
Great question. Yeah, so what does freedom mean to the working class? Well, I think we can sort of develop that by looking back at those two ideas of freedom, right? So if you look at what working people talk about these days as our biggest problems, before and after the virus, by farthest far, the biggest concern people have is healthcare, because you only get health insurance through your job in America unless you're old enough or for Social Security or Medicare, or poor enough for Medicaid and it's expanded in your state, which it may not be. A lot of people can't get access to healthcare. And even those of us who are lucky, to be working full time, and so we get health insurance through our jobs, you'd be amazed what those insurance cartels will do to make you still pay for your health care. You have deductibles and coverage limits and co-pays and co-insurance and network exclusions, and they'll decide whether you deserve a scan or not. So if you look at working people, they'll tell you their biggest concern is healthcare, as it should be. Like, what's more fundamental than you and your kids' health? Like, when you have nothing else about your, you say, well, at least I've got my health, right? One example I like to point out is, like, even, people may have heard, the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in America is health expenses. Big surprise, right? Everyone knows how expensive healthcare is. If you don't, you will, young people. When you get old and sick, you'll discover it's insanely costly to get sick or get hurt, in the country. But what I like to point out is, among those people who go bankrupt because of healthcare costs, a majority of them have health insurance. But it's American corporate health insurance. So while you're getting your chemo or your operations because you had a car crash, the co-insurance and deductibles pile up and you still go bankrupt. So you weren't really insured. All those years that you were paying a fifth of your paycheck into your workplace health plan, if you still go bankrupt when you get sick, you weren't really insured because they just won't pay, So one of the biggest concerns people have is just preserving their lives, and especially now in this twisted virus pandemic environment, right? So there's a reason why things like Medicare for all, which is such a simple policy. Medicare, my parents are retired. I know a ton of people who are on Medicare, the publicly funded, publicly run health insurance plan for people over 63 or whatever the retirement age is now, I forget. Like, that's something that's very popular and would be very easy to expand it to the rest of us, the rest of the population. Well, fighting for that became, in this last year's Democratic primary, a basic thing that so many candidates who clearly were not telling the truth had to at least say that they liked, like Kamala Harris, then Elizabeth Warren, and a few of them, like maybe Warren and Sanders, were able to really push up for it. Like, that's just a relatively simple political change that would get us all a real increase in our positive freedom, our freedom to consume some of the huge amount of health services, which are enormous economy. Remember, we have a $20 trillion GDP in our economy now. That's the value of all the goods and services the US produced in 2019, the last year we have numbers for. That's an insane amount. It's easily productive enough for us all to have health insurance, but the insurance industry wants to make money by denying care, so that's what happens. Well, that would be a simple, easy way to increase the freedom of the working class, the positive freedom. But another way would be to get more unionization, I would say, in the blue and white collar segments of the American workforce, because that would give us that collective bargaining strength to push back, at least to push back against the tech billionaires and say, no, you're not just going to tell us what the terms of service are. You're not just going to tell us to ignore the guy next to me coughing with what sounds like COVID-19. Like, no, we'll go on strike, or we'll make a contract that tells you what you can and can't do to us. You can't just push us around all the time. So those are relatively simple things, like unionizing and getting some social democratic policies, like a universal health insurance program. I think those things would be good for our positive freedom to consume healthcare and have longer, better lives, so that even if you get sick or get hit by a car or get COVID-19, at least you're not having to think, how am I going to pay for it? Which is what so many Americans live with all the time. Like, people are dying of COVID-19 wondering how they're going to pay for treatment. Like, that is a fact. And us having unions, letting us have some of our own worker power, gives you some of that negative freedom too, where you're free from other people's power. I'm lucky enough to be in a unionized workplace. May I say, I recommend it. I think it's a very useful thing to have some countervailing power in the workforce, at least. So those would be some things I could think of, or I would suggest.
Nice. And I just saw Alice in the chat board just said, we also need to ask how much our government is actually motivated to give the working class more freedom. And to be honest about the answer to that.
Absolutely. Elections are very expensive. Romney and Obama spent between them $1 billion running their presidential campaigns, like it's expensive. And so these these people running for president or the Senate or governors have to make a lot of promises to wealthy people and big corporations to get that money to buy airtime and buy flyers and all that and pay for staff. So of course they're going to make a lot of promises. Like, we're not going to regulate you guys. We're not going to make you let your workers organize. We're not going to provide healthcare to people because the insurance and drug industries don't want that. So it's true. The government is a big part of this. And again, that's why I go straight to policy like Medicare for all. We need to organize our workplaces. We need policies like these, or we're not going to have any more freedom than we got now.
Nice. Well, last Wednesday, I signed off by promising everyone, encourage everyone to tune in this week, because you were going to not only inform, but entertain. And you have definitely done that. I think your sense of humor definitely adds some sugar to the strong medicine you're sort of giving us all in your revelation of these, these sort of various unfreedoms that corporate, oligopolies are instituting on our regular daily lives. So I wanted to say again how much I appreciate you giving us the time, and how much I appreciate the work. I'll put in a plug for this book. Is fantastic. You all should go out and check it out immediately. And again, keep up the great work. And I know I am feeling extremely inspired by this, and I hope everybody else is too. So next week, we're going to be going back in time. We're going to be looking at early Washington labor history with David Jepson, the director of Labor Wars of the Pacific Northwest, which is a very cool documentary. So everybody come back and check that out. Have you seen it yet, Rob?
I actually only saw the trailer. They showed it at work, and I couldn't be there that day. I felt very ripped off. So I might have to come back and watch that too.
Yes. So come, please check it out. And thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks again, Rob Larson. Thanks for the work.
My pleasure, man. Thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody.
All right.